Hi guys, this is Matt Hamilton with US Lacrosse Magazine, and we're diving into our 5 and 5 series, and we're excited to have ESPN's Anish on to do his top 5 lacrosse rivalries of all time. This should be a good one. So Anish, welcome to the show. First question before we dive into the top 5 here is, how hard was this to put together? There's a lot of rivalries in lacrosse, so how difficult was this to make 5?
Yeah, there were a lot of regional rivalries, there were a lot of national rivalries. And so for me, the big thing was finding somewhat of a consistent metric, right? And I kept on coming back to this. In a growing sport like lacrosse, rivalry games should elevate the entire sport. They should enhance the entire sport. Easy to default to Ohio State, Michigan, or Duke, North Carolina. But the reality is, in lacrosse, while those are still rivalry games and they mean a lot to their fan base, they just don't have the cachet of that same matchup in other sports, be it basketball for Duke, UNC, or football for Ohio State, Michigan. So I really wanted to find 5 that I thought elevated the entire sport. And then ranking them, you can kind of nitpick a little bit, who should be 1, who should be 2. But I think 4 of the 5 that I had there, I felt good about how these rivalries elevated the entire sport. And then there's one there which I think is a rivalry that, as I wrote, threads the fabric of college sports.
Yeah, and so let's dive into this top 5 here. We got 5 great matchups. So we'll go 5-1. So number 5, you have Denver, Notre Dame. Obviously, some great matchups recently there. Number 4 is a classic one, Syracuse, Virginia. Number 3, Army, Navy. And then this is where it gets interesting. Number 2, you have Johns Hopkins, Maryland. And then number 1, you have Johns Hopkins, Syracuse. So there's probably a lot of fans that, are kind of disputing those two there. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But I want to start at number 5. We'll dive into a couple of these matchups here. So number 5, you have Denver, Notre Dame. Pretty new rivalry, but obviously pretty impactful. So dive into why you made that number 5 on your list.
Yeah, that was the hardest one. I had about a dozen options for number 5, and I kept on coming back to Denver, Notre Dame. Again, rivalries that elevate the sport. Is it a new rivalry? Yes. But these are the 2 Western powers. These are the 2 powers that are also outposts, geographically speaking. And I think we all assumed at the start of this past decade that Notre Dame was going to be the first power outside of the geographical hotbeds to win a national championship. They came really close in 2010. They were back at championship weekend a few years later. And then all of a sudden, Bill Tierney comes to Denver, and it's Denver, that emerging power. And on their way to that first championship in 2013, they knock off Notre Dame in an epic semifinal. And that was a stretch of games where these 2 are playing every year, and something like 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 6 went into overtime. And so when you look at the geographical spread of this sport, Denver and Notre Dame have been the 2 powers outside of the traditional hotbeds, and they have a rivalry. They play every year. To me, that rivalry represents maybe not where lacrosse is, but where it's headed.
Mm-hmm. Been some classic games in that rivalry for sure. We're going to move on to another one that, Army-Navy rivalry is obviously, a world-renowned rivalry in many sports, but I think there are some fans that may not see that as a top rivalry in lacrosse. So you have Army-Navy as number 3. Why did you kind of pick that one and see that one as a top 3 rivalry?
Listen, to me, that is a top 5, top 3, whatever you want to call it. It's a top rivalry, and it doesn't matter what collegiate sport they're playing. We know the pomp and circumstance that goes with the Army-Navy football game. It's a big deal when they play in other sports as well. But again, I look at what's the biggest day for college lacrosse. It's Memorial Day, right? And what 3 institutions represent that day more than anybody else? It's Army, Navy, and Air Force. And so I think, again, Air Force doesn't have quite the history in lacrosse that the other 2 do. And obviously Navy's got a really rich and steep history. But again, those 2 playing in the Patriot League, the pomp, the circumstance, what it means to those fan bases, go Army, beat Navy, go Navy, beat Army. I just think that's a rivalry that threads college sports. That defines what college sports is all about. And, it could be lacrosse, it could be field hockey, it could be cornhole. Army-Navy is going to be in my top 5.
There you go. That's a good quote. I mean, it's a classic rivalry for sure. And so 2-1, we're moving to some classic historic lacrosse rivalries. And you have Johns Hopkins, Syracuse as number 1. That's obviously, a giant rivalry there. You have it over Hopkins, Maryland. Many people probably would say Hopkins, Maryland is number one, but just give me your top game in this Hopkins-Syracuse rivalry and why this rivalry means so much to you and to fans out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's three elements. One, I think one of the defining games, maybe the singular game in the history of modern college lacrosse, the 1989 championship, was Syracuse against Johns Hopkins, and two programs kind of at the peak of their powers. And you had Gary Gate on one side, you had Dave Petramala on the other. So you have, to me, all the elements of a great rivalry here. Is this a rivalry steeped with history in terms of the ledger as deep as Maryland Hopkins? No. But Hopkins had been, the Goliath for so long. And then Syracuse came along, and at first it was, okay, this is a worthy challenger. And then later, this is now an equal. And as we went through the 80s, we really saw the emergence of Syracuse. And Syracuse made that a rivalry. It was more of a rivalry for Syracuse. It became a rivalry for Hopkins. And I thought that element, meant something. And then you have this game, this 89 championship game, which to me is the game that if you're trying to introduce somebody to lacrosse who's never seen it before, hey, watch 30 minutes of this game with me and you make a fan. And then you have the individual dynamic. You had Gate and Petro, arguably the greatest offensive player and the greatest defensive player, and they're going up against each other. And so that's that Magic Bird, DiMaggio, Williams dynamic, the game within the game. And so you factor all those elements, plus these are the two winningest programs in the NCAA era. They've been Final Four fixtures for years. I put that slightly ahead of Johns Hopkins, Maryland for that reason, because that was a rivalry, I think, more than any other dynamic that has really elevated the sport of college lacrosse over the last 30, 40 years.
Awesome. Well, you walked through that top five pretty well there. Our time is up. We really appreciate you taking out the time to walk through your top five. I'm sure this is one that'll get the fans talking a little bit. So, Anish, we thank you again for taking the time to run through this top five.
You got it.